Joining us now are two key members of the Senate Armed Services Committee just back from the Middle East, Republican Lindsey Graham and Democrat Richard Blumenthal. And Senators, welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
The President and Prime Minister will be wrestling with two key questions tomorrow. First, what are their red lines? How far each leader will allow Iran to go before giving up on diplomacy? And second, how committed is each to a military strike if Iran crosses that red line? Senator Graham, what does President Obama need to say to Prime Minister Netanyahu to reassure him?
That I am committed to stopping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, not only in words but in deeds, that if necessary we'll use military force, and they need a common definition of what kind of change would be acceptable on Iran's part.
Meaning the red line, how far they're willing to allow Iran to go.
There needs to be a common definition conveyed privately to Iran so they'll know what they need to do.
Senator Blumenthal, does President Obama need to go further than he has so far in reassuring the Israelis?
I think that he needs to give a more specific and muscular content to the formulaic expression that's been used again and again and again. All options are on the table, to say that containment is not an option, that a nuclear-armed Iran, for all the reasons that he stated so powerfully in the interview that he did recently with Jeff Goldberg, is simply unacceptable because it would destabilize the Middle East, it would create access for terrorists to nuclear armaments, and it would make the Middle East a nuclear tinderbox. And that's the kind of passion and specificity that he needs to bring to this conversation now.
All right. On the other hand, Senator Blumenthal, does Prime Minister Netanyahu need to give tougher sanctions that have been imposed, an oil embargo by Europe against Iran, tougher measures against Iran's central bank? Does he need to give those more time to work before he launches a unilateral military strike?
You know, Israel's interests are its own, just as our interests have to be our own. Our national interest has to be the guiding principle. And the cooperation, we come back from a trip recently to the Middle East, my impression is that that cooperation, strategic and intelligence, has never been stronger between these two allies. And the Prime Minister of Israel has to recognize that the United States has its own interests, but in this case they are aligned with Israel's.
But there is a disagreement here. I mean, is, Senator Graham, a disagreement at this point about how far they should allow Iran to go and at what point a military strike should be triggered.
There's a difference in capability.
But also a difference in their assessment of the situation.
There's an intelligence picture difference, but here's what we agree on. We've been talking with Iran for 3 years. They keep enriching. We've been sanctioning Iran seriously, I think in an effective way, for about the last 6 months. They keep enriching. They have 3,000 kilograms of low-enriched uranium, 1.5 times more than they need to make a bomb. So here's the situation in Israel. Their military capability is less than ours. There'll come a point where these sites get hardened, and they are being hardened. If they wanted to build a power plant for peaceful purposes, the Iranians are going at it in a very odd way. When you put their rhetoric and their behavior together with their nuclear program, if you're Israel, you can't lose control of your own destiny. So that's what the Prime Minister of Israel told us. We will not lose control of our own destiny. We want sanctions to work. We will give them time. But when the Iranians get to the point where our military capability is not sufficient to stop their program, that's the red line for us. And we have a different point militarily than they do, and there's the conflict.
And how should that be resolved? Should it be resolved on what the Israeli capabilities are and what at the point at which they have to strike?
We should be talking about...
Or should they be willing to rely on the United States?
Quickly, we should not be talking about our differences. We should be talking about our commonalities. President's statement on not containing a nuclear-armed Iran was great. We should be talking about Iran's behavior, not our differences. And you've got to understand this. The Israeli government and people will not lose control of their own destiny, period. That's the end of the discussion from their point of view. Sanctions could work, have not worked yet, but there'll come a point in time where they will lose control of their destiny militarily, and they're not going to let that happen, and we should acknowledge it and say that's okay with us.
So that, in other words, when they say we will no longer have the capability to take out the nuclear problem, we're not going to rely on the U.S., we're going to do it ourselves.
We should understand that's a reasonable position for the Israelis to take, and we should support that position and hope we never get there.
And hope that our assurances will enable them to understand how we will be their ally, how we will stop a nuclear-armed Iran, how we will not tolerate it as a matter of our national interest, not Israeli interest. The focus is so much on restraining the Israelis, but it ought to be on making sure that our commonality of interest is served by a strong United States policy that convinces the Iranians that they are crippling their economy, they are brutalizing their people, and the United States, at the end of the day, is not going to accept a nuclear-armed Iran.
Let's turn to Afghanistan and the blowback to the burning of several Qurans in that country in the last couple of weeks. In recent days, 6 U.S. servicemen have been killed by our Afghan partners, and the reaction from some leading Republicans and conservatives has been striking.
There's some problems what you have to do is say, you know, you're going to have to figure out how to live your own miserable life.
It's gotten to the point where, why are we there? If this is the end result of us being there, let's get these people out, bring them home, and the hell with the place over there.
Senator Graham, are Newt Gingrich and Rush Limbaugh wrong?
They're expressing frustration, but I know why we're there. General Allen will be here in 2 weeks to tell the Congress why we're there.
And he's the commander of U.S. forces in
He's the commander.
Afghanistan.
I spent an hour on the phone with him. There are 30 million Afghans. It breaks your heart when 6 soldiers are killed for an inadvertent burning of a religious document. They left their homes and their families to help the Afghans. But this is not a total picture of what's going on in Afghanistan. We have made progress, and we do have strong allies within Afghanistan. So don't let this snapshot ruin the strategic importance. General Allen will tell us why it's important we get it right. If we leave, and it falls back into Taliban hands and al-Qaeda reemerges, we'll pay a heavy price. History will not judge us by the day we left, but by what we left behind. And General Allen has a plan for us to withdraw our troops, and the key to this is a strategic partnership agreement telling the Taliban, the Iranians, the Pakistanis will have a follow-on military force, and the Taliban will never come back. What we do after 2014 and the way we do it determines our long-term security interests.
Senator Blumenthal, same basic question to you. When Afghan troops, Afghan police are turning their weapons not on the Taliban but on U.S. soldiers, when you see leading conservatives saying it's time to go to the exits, is it time to get out of Afghanistan?
We will be getting out of Afghanistan, hopefully with that strategic partnership.
In 2.5 years.
On the timetable and with the strategy that General Allen and the commanders and the troops there are following.
So you wouldn't speed up?
I think if we can speed up and accelerate that withdrawal with the kind of strategic partnership that we are building, and with special operators continuing to make the progress in taking out targets and turning over that function to the Afghans, that certainly is a goal to be pursued. But let's remember, Chris, very importantly, 3 tremendous problems in Afghanistan: economic weakness, safe havens, corruption in the government. Right. Beyond this incident, which is tragic, absolutely tragic for both sides, really, there is an important point here that we need to stick to this strategy and overcome this incident.
Finally, because we're running out of time, and I want to talk about one last trouble spot, and that is Syria and the slaughter of the opposition, of civilians in Syria continues unabated. Senator Graham, what should the U.S. do? Should we start arming the opposition, and what do we do about Assad?
I think the opposition needs military support. You could probably do it from the Arab League. Working with Senator Blumenthal, we're going to do a sense of the Senate resolution calling on the United Nations to declare Assad a war criminal because he is. We need more international pressure. We need to help the rebels militarily, economically, and let Assad know that he's an international outlaw and be held accountable
when you
for his
say,
actions.
I missed what you said. When you said arm him in a
I think the Arab League would be a good vehicle to provide military assistance to the opposition forces, and we should consider that. We should consider no drive, no fly zone too pretty quickly.
So you're saying basically what we did in Libya?
I think the Libyan model could serve us well.
Senator Blumenthal?
You know, Secretary Clinton is doing a very good job of bringing together the world community as well as the Arab League in support of some kind of aid to the opposition. And that aid can be technical assistance, communications equipment, humanitarian aid, financial support, and, if possible, arms that would go indirectly. There are means to do it. But it should be under the auspices of the international community, as Secretary Clinton is endeavoring to do. And this resolution, I think, will send a very important message. First of all, on Iran, on Israel, on Syria, we are bipartisan.
Absolutely.
And bipartisanship is breaking out, as I saw on this great trip that we took with Senator McCain. There is very strong support for the kinds of initiatives that we saw in Libya. And Libya is a model for how we can aid rebels. But let me emphasize, Chris, no American troops, none, no American troops on the ground in direct aid that will bolster that opposition.
Senator Blumenthal, Senator Graham, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you both so much for coming in today, and we will see what comes out of that key Obama-Netanyahu meeting tomorrow. Thank you, gentlemen, both.
Thank you.
To Tel Aviv now, where cash-strapped Israeli students have a new way to relieve their financial plight. They can get easy money by simply posting positive tweets and clicking the like button in all the right places. This after authorities came up with the idea of offering youngsters salaries and even scholarships for the protection of the government's interests and fighting anti-Semitism on the web. Ironically, though, the father of the digital diplomacy program has now come under fire for posting racist comments, the very thing he was meant to be preventing. Paula Sleer takes up the story.
Public opinion against Israel is at an all-time low. Recent wars with Gaza and the seemingly never-ending occupation have left the country waging a PR war.
This is a very massive wave of this false propaganda and attempts to legitimize, our right to defend ourselves and even our right to live in our historic land. So we have to do everything to tell the truth.
For 65 years, Israeli diplomats have struggled in their posts. In the modern world, they need all the help they can get. Enter the undergrads. The idea is to pay students to tweet pro-Israeli propaganda. Lidor Bar David has been doing it for a while, but as a volunteer.
It's another way to a student to give back to society. Even in Israel, you have a bunch of people, a few people at the Foreign Affairs Ministry office who do social media for their living. So it's okay for people to getting a salary on this kind of work.
The new student sales force will share a PR commission pot of nearly $1 million. And in universities across the country, they'll eventually even receive scholarships for waging Israel's digital diplomacy. But before these new recruits could even start tweeting, liking or hashtagging, there was a PR blunder. The guy tapped to head the social media advocacy has already been put to pasture. Take a look at his Facebook page. Daniel Seaman is known for being abrasive to the foreign media, but that's not all. Seaman called Palestinians stupid in an expletive-laden rant. Critics pounced, taking the opportunity to question the basic ethics of the new approach.
So you're basically turning a human being into a human commercial.
Uri Agnon is a second-year philosophy student who says he won't be signing up. He's angry with his government trying to tell him what to think.
Instead of trying to make Israel a good democracy, for instance, giving out scholarships for people that will try to make this place a better place, he gives out scholarships for people to say that it's a good place. I mean, if this was such a good place, then these people would tell it anyways.
Those in opposition say there will be some major whitewashing, and using students to tweet pro-Israeli propaganda is part of that.
I think the Prime Minister's office is trying to cover up the human rights violations that are happening by paying young folks to be involved. I think he'd be better off investing the funds in education, in infrastructure, in community development that he hasn't done in decades.
Israelis are no stranger to war, but at the online frontline, it's an unenviable battle to turn public perception of Israel from zero to zeitgeist. Paula Sleer, RT, Tel Aviv.
Do you think that it really started by chance, or do you think that it has been a plot for this whole region, and especially Syria right now?
Well, I think a lot of things happened in 2001. So the crisis that confronts Syria today is not created in 2011. This is something that happened well in advance, a decade earlier.
Yes.
remember what we were doing, what the world was doing in 2001.
Yes.
2001 was the year of the Durban World Conference Against Racism. And at that conference, people from all over the world gathered, and they talked about their grievances about the way the world is currently structured. And a part of that discussion was about Zionism, if you will recall.
Yes.
I was there. I was there as a member of Congress. I represented the United States. So it's not quite accurate to say that the United States wasn't there. The United States was there. Members of Congress chose to go. Certain members of Congress went. I was among them. And then, literally days later, September 11th, 2001 happened, the tragedies that struck the United States.
Yes.
Changed the politics, changed the international scenario that was unfolding. And the world has been in turmoil ever since.
Yes. So you think that all what is happening now is related to that?
Well, I think we need to step back and take a look at what we know now as opposed to what we knew back then. And what we know now is that, at least from General Wesley Clark, who also ran for president, he unveiled a policy, what he called a policy coup that had taken place inside the United States. And the crux of the coup was that the United States was going to invade 7 countries in 5 years. So it's not just Syria.
Yes.
It's Syria, Sudan, Somalia, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran, Libya. 7 countries in 5 years, and that, I believe, is what we see unfolding.
Yes. Some people say that the U.S. is trying to, they are trying their weapons, the modern technologies in weaponry. They want to try it, so that's why they are using them here in this area. Do you think that it's true?
I think that's a side benefit. What we call a collateral benefit. It's not the reason.
Yes.
You can test them where they're not people, from among other things, you know. No, they're using them here because they want to dominate this region, and they want to exploit it. When I say they, I mean our economic aggression toward other countries, our desire to dominate, and particularly now when we see bigger countries, China, emerging as a competitor that can outdo us. We're hastening to establish dominion wherever we can.
I am the victim of one particular lobby in the United States. You mentioned specifically AIPAC, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee.
Yes.
And the pro-Israel lobby inside the United States deemed that my voice was too strong on behalf of peace and justice in this region of the world, and that it was time for me to go. And so in 2002, I was targeted along with a fellow colleague of mine from Alabama. Me, the first African-American woman to serve the state of Georgia in the United States Congress, targeted by the pro-Israel lobby, not because of anything that I did that was offensive to people in my district, not because of anything that I did that was offensive to people in the United States, but because I dared to think that Palestinians deserved human rights. And the same goes for my fellow colleague, the first African-American male who was elected to the Congress from the state of Alabama since Reconstruction, which is a civil war. And so we have not been able to contain the power of this particular interest group inside the United States Congress. That's why the decision to take the matter of military strikes against Syria to the Congress was a very interesting moment, because we had according to one report that I received from an investigative journalist, General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, visiting the White House, asking the White House, instead of unleashing the bombs over Syria, unleash public opinion in the Congress. And this Congress is the bastion of AIPAC. So it would have been very interesting to have had that debate. I'm glad we didn't have the debate. I'm glad that tragedy has been averted for the moment. We must remain vigilant, though, however. We must remain vigilant because the situation could change at any moment.
So this is a fake democracy. But the U.S. Says that it is a democratic country. This is not democracy.
Well, all you have to do is go back to the founding fathers and ask. There were so many black people in the United States that had been imported from Africa. They didn't have the right to vote. Women didn't have the right to vote. Poor whites didn't have the right to vote. So what kind of democracy is that?
Unfortunately,
لسوء الحظ نعم.
U.S. corporate power,
فإن قوة الشركات
the
الأمريكية
military and oil industries of the U.S.
والصناعات العسكرية والبتروكيميائية الأمريكية حازمة ومصرة جدا مصرة من جديد على الدفع قدما نحو الحرب
against the overwhelming feeling of the population
وذلك
of the US
ضد الإرادة الطاغية للشعب الأمريكي
and the whole world
والعالم أجمع
because they profit from war.
وسبب ذلك هو الأرباح الطائلة إلى التجميع هذه الشركات والصناعات جراء هذه الحرب.
And we, the people of the US,
ونحن
pay,
الشعب الأمريكي هم من يدفع
and also the people of the countries targeted
وأيضا
by US wars.
الشعوب التي تستهدف من قبل الحرب آلة الحرب الأمريكية إننا ندفع ثمنا غاليا جدا.
هل تعتقدي بأن الشعب الأمريكي حاليا يتعرض لأكبر عملية تضليل إعلامي بعد ما شهده خلال الحرب على العراق؟ لكن هذه المرة في سوريا.
The wars are so similar
إن الحروب متشابهة
based entirely on lies.
لأن هذه الحروب جميعها
on war propaganda.
بنيت على كذبة كبيرة.
On demonizing the government and
وهذه
the people
الحروب تكمن أيضا وتعتمد على شيطنة الحكومات ورؤساء الدول.
To try to whip up the US population.
إن هدفنا هو إيقاظ الشعب الأمريكي
To feel threatened.
ليشعر بأنه تحت الخطر.
Syria has not attacked the US.
بالطبع أن سوريا لم تهاجم الولايات المتحدة. ولكن
US propaganda is
لكن
powerful.
الحملة الإعلامية الأمريكية هي حملة قوية وشرسة جدا.
And 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
حملة مستمرة على مدار اليوم لمدة 7 أيام ولطيلة الأسبوع وهي تقدم نفس الأمثلة والأدلة والنماذج مرة تلو الأخرى.
But because of past lies,
ولكن بسبب الأكاذيب التي شاهدناها في السابق
people are beginning to form their own
بات الشعب الأمريكي واعيا لهذه وهو يعمل على تكوين رأيه الشخصي بحد ذاته.
In many ways, the U.S. empire
بطرق مختلفة فإن الإمبراطورية الأمريكية
is in decline. The very fact that the Obama administration
إن حقيقة أن إدارة أوباما قررت ألا تمضي قدما في تصويت فهذا يعني أن هذه الإدارة شعرت في ذلك الوقت أنها لن تنجح في مسعاها هذه. نحن نعرف أنهم سيتقدمون أو سيخلقون كذبة جديدة. ولكننا مصممون وعازمون على إسماع صوتنا. ولأن نقول أن الولايات المتحدة ليس لديها الحق. إنها جريمة حرب. كما أنها انتهاك لميثاق الأمم المتحدة. وهي كذلك انتهاك للدستور الأمريكي. إنه انتهاك كامل وصارخ للقانون الدولي والحقوق الإنسانية.
The average person in the US today
إن المواطن العادي في الأمريكي لا يعرف اليوم
how much money Israel gets from the US government.
كم تربح إسرائيل من الأموال الأمريكية
وكم تتلقى من الأموال، لكن هذه الأموال تدفع لإسرائيل لأن إسرائيل تخدم أهداف وول ستريت بغية خلق عدم استقرار في هذه المنطقة، إضافة إلى حروب دائمة. وبالطبع فإن ذلك يساعد في بيع الأسلحة الأمريكية ليس فقط لإسرائيل ولكن إلى مصر وقطر والسعودية والإمارات العربية المتحدة، بلد تلو الآخر. هناك أرباح طائلة جراء بيع الأسلحة الأمريكية وجراء الوضع القائم. حروب دائمة تم شنها على مدار 16 عاما، لذلك أقول أن إسرائيل تخدم أهداف ومصالح الولايات المتحدة، لأن هناك بلد تم زرعه في المنطقة وسرق الأراضي الشعب الفلسطيني.
Because I'd been through the Pentagon right after 9/11. About 10 days after 9/11, I went through the Pentagon and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the joint staff who had used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, "No." He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs," meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today, and he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq.
My fellow citizens, at this hour, American and coalition forces are in the early stages of military operations to disarm Iraq, to free its people, and to defend the world from grave danger.
And then Syria.
We had a chance to talk about a wide range of international issues, including the situation in Syria. And I have to say that all of us who've been seeing the terrible pictures coming out of Syria and Homs recently recognize it is absolutely imperative for the international community to rally and send a clear message to President Assad that it is time for a transition, it is time for that regime to move on, and it is time to stop the killing of Syrian citizens by their own government.
Lebanon.
They both had different reasons, the State Department and the White House, for wanting Israel to do it, encouraging them to do it, supporting them. Our Air Force worked very closely with the Israeli Air Force for months before this, not necessarily with a deadline, knowing when it would happen. It was always going to be whenever there was an incident, they would take advantage of an incident. The word I used was fortunate timing. When Hezbollah grabbed some of the Israeli soldiers in early July, that was then a pretext, I think that's the only word, for a major offensive that had been in the works a long time.
Libya.
Today we can definitively say that the Gaddafi regime has come to an end. The last major regime strongholds have fallen. The new government is consolidating the control over the country, and one of the world's longest-serving dictators is no more.
Somalia.
Well, violence isn't only on the rise in Afghanistan. In fact, it looks like America's shadow wars have now increased by 1. Drone strikes have long been reported in Pakistan and Yemen, but now there's news that a week ago, A U.S. drone aircraft fired on 2 leaders of the Somalian organization Al-Shabaab.
Sudan.
President Obama is sending 100 combat-equipped troops to Central Africa to advise local forces on getting rid of one of the continent's most vicious operatives, Joseph Kony, the head of the Lord's Resistance Army, a group responsible for atrocities across the region. It's the first open deployment of U.S. ground combat power to Africa since the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia in the 1990s that killed 18 troops. U.S. troops may wind up now in Uganda, South Sudan, the Central African Republic, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's part of a growing military effort to engage in Africa.
Finishing off Iran. I said, is it classified? He said, yes, sir. I said, well, don't show it to me. And I saw him a year or so ago, and I said, you remember that? He said, sir, I didn't show you that memo. I didn't show it to you.
I'm sorry, what did you say his name was?
I'm not going to give you his name.
So go through the countries again?
Well, starting with Iraq, then Syria and Lebanon, then Libya, then Somalia and Sudan, and then back to Iran.